So by 1917, for all the belligerents, things started to get bad. So for Germany, things were quite bad because of the British blockade. Um, Austria-Hungary, it was even worse since they were even more cut off from trade. France, things were starting to get worse, and for Britain, things are starting to get worse. So all the belligerents are feeling the pressure, and it's hitting their civilians now. Even despite their propaganda, the civilians are starting to get antsy now that this war's been going on 3 years. So, and to try to undo the stalemate, again, kind of tried the same ideas. The French kicked out their prior commander and they put in place Robert Nivelle, who seemed like a good choice. He was the hero of the Battle of Verdun, famous for telling his troops, "You shall not let them pass," which appeared on propaganda all across France. If you have ever read or watched the movie Lord of the Rings, J.R.R. Tolkien, he was a participant in the First World War. He served in the Battle of the Somme as a lieutenant, and a number of his experiences that he had in the First World War informed his books. The kind of the last stand of the soldiers, the French. I mean, that was the propaganda all over France, and the British soldiers in France as well. The marshes that that the hobbits have to slog through. Tolkien said that was inspired by the rain and the mud that he and his troops had experienced in northern Belgium. But Nivelle, as a result of his kind of inspirational conduct at the Battle of Verdun, it was thought maybe he would be able to turn the war around. And he came up with an idea for an offensive on kind of the northern side of the front, which it seemed like an okay idea, but essentially it became another mini Verdun. The French lost about as many soldiers as the Germans, and that was quite upsetting. Probably the most significant outcome of it was that the French soldiers just got sick of fighting. And if you watch the episode of the documentary about mutiny, it talks about this. The soldiers just in the French army during the Nivelle offensive, they did kind of a sit-down strike. They refused to follow their officers' orders to attack. And this spread all across the French armies that were involved in this offensive, which shocked the French commanders to an enormous degree. What was amazing about the whole event was that the news of the mutinies was kept under wraps. The propaganda and information control was so good that the French kept that news of their troops just refusing officers' orders, kept that news from leaking into Germany. So the Germans didn't know. The Germans had a huge opportunity to just blow through the front right there if they had attacked during those mutinies, and they did not. The reason that Nivelle couldn't really advance further than he wanted, because the French would find this out again, and the British would also find this out. The Germans actually engaged a controlled retreat back to what was called the Hindenburg Line during the first half of 1917. It was actually before one of the other battles called the Battle of Arras. And it was a really smart move. They concentrated their forces and in this very complex trench system that was much better built than the Allied trenches. So basically underground cities with like logistical systems that were underground and everything. And so the Germans always had fewer troops than the Allies on the front. And they had, by 1917 and going into except for the offensive 1918, for a while, they had barely half as many troops as the Allies at some points. And so the move backwards, that controlled retreat onto what was called that Hindenburg Line, kind of the fortress trenches, the French couldn't get past that, and that was part of that difficulty. Was part of what caused the mutinies. But luckily for the French, the mutinies never leaked out in terms of news. The result was that Nivelle got fired, and he was replaced by Philippe Pétain, another of the heroes of Verdun. And Pétain never quite forgot, and Pétain is going to become important in the Second World War as he takes over the Nazi-controlled France after the French lost in 1940. And he never really got over the despair that had motivated those troops to mutiny. In order to kind of get the troops to cooperate after Nivelle was fired, was to basically kind of communicate to them, we're no longer going to waste your lives, at least not so absurdly as we have been doing. And so the cult of the offensive kind of died with that mutiny, and that affected French military culture going forward, especially with Pétain, who was kind of despondent about it. So another just mini Verdun happened at a battle called Third Ypres or Passchendaele, which was a British-led initiative, and became this another symbol of the First World War, because the weather was so bad, the mud would be like 5-6 feet deep, and so all the soldiers involved just sank into that mud at Passchendaele, and it was terrible for the soldiers to experience. So many of them died of sickness as a result. It also didn't accomplish anything, basically accomplished more stalemate. It actually wasn't a bad idea, because the goal of the British was to try to push through the line, which would allow them to capture some of the Belgian coastal cities where the Germans had their U-boat bases. That was a decent idea, but it didn't work out, in part because the weather just didn't cooperate, and both sides, the Germans and the British, just fell apart trying to fight that battle, which, similar to Verdun and the Somme, it went on for months. So by mid-1917, getting toward 1918, the initial enthusiasm, and you saw this in the various output of artists and poets, poetry in particular, who experienced the First World War, they started out very excited. In the beginning of the war, some of the most famous poets were the ones who wrote about all of this patriotism and love of country and stuff like that. And you saw a lot of the best-selling books and novels and whatnot were kind of these nationalist tracts. The art also was quite patriotic. The people who had been critical of war, like when you watched that first episode of the documentary, people like Jean Jaurès, I mean, they were seen as traitors by a lot of their compatriots. So that was not the case by 1917. You started to see the art get much darker. One of your films talks about this, the artistic movements. People like Otto Dix, they started these movements that were just steeped in negativity and darkness and anger and despair and hopelessness. And you started to see more and more output like this. One of the most famous poets of the First World War was Wilfred Owen, and posthumously, his parents published one of his poems called Dulce et decorum est, which basically says, and it's the last part of the poem is listed there, and basically he's saying there is no beauty in dying for your country. The old lie, it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. No, it's not. It's ugly. It's disgusting, and it's just tragic. And there's nothing good that comes out of it. You see that same kind of attitude permeated a lot of the war-related literature well into the 1920s and 30s. It was considered unpatriotic by the time the Nazis took over, and they kicked out a lot of the poets and artists that wrote about it. The Germans. The British and French, this idea was powerful, and in America, the idea was powerful. And so I think at least one of you is reading All Quiet on the Western Front. It also is a continuation of this narrative that there's nothing glorious about war. It's just this big pool of quicksand that you die in. And you started to see some element of despondency among the population, which is why the propaganda got more intense. Again, like I said before, a tragic outcome was that the propaganda had to lie so badly that people believed the lies and carried that with them. This also inspired a lot of kind of anti-war sentiment in America, especially where there are people arguing we don't need to get into this.